Anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Liberty McArtor.
Well, hello from Dallas, where it is a balmy 100 degrees. Wherever you're listening from, I'm glad you're with me today. I'm sitting in for Kirby Anderson. And once again, a great show lined up. In just a moment, we will be speaking with Dean Sikes, and he has such a hopeful message for teenagers. So if you are a parent of teens, or you are a youth minister or a teacher, you're want to listen to this interview, because there's so much hope and encouragement there. Later in the hour, we'll talk with Dustin Garrett. He has an amazing testimony and such a relevant message for young men as well. And then the next hour, get into some current events and news of the day and another great interview. But Dean, I'm so glad that you joined me on Point of View today. You have such an important message to share, so thanks for being here.
Liberty, it's my honor. Thankful for the opportunity and glad to be with you today.
So, Dean, you're the author of You Matter, Finding Hope and Meaning in Everyday Life, as well as over 30 other books, and you have spoken with millions of teenagers around the nation. You host the You Matter television broadcast, and so this is really ministering to young people with this message of hope and healing is something that's very close to your heart. So before we dive into a bit of your story, tell us why this message is so needed right now, considering the mental health state of so many teenagers today.
Yeah, great question. Right now, what we see in America across the board, whether it's public schools, private schools, homeschools, Christian schools, I see hopelessness on steroids. The Word teaches us that with a vision, you can literally, without it, people perish, right?
Yeah.
Without vision, my people perish. What happens when you actually invert that? And you actually say, with vision, what could a person do? What happens when a young person really catches on to what they're called to do? Romans tells us the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable. Gifts are plural, but calling is singular. And I believe, Liberty, when I share this message with students, one of the things that I've said for almost 34 years now is that your purpose, your destiny, your calling is not yours to decide. It's yours to discover. And when you discover it and you base it on scripture and verse, and you find out why you are here, then you begin to better understand why the enemy has tried so hard to just bombard you with this thing called hopelessness. And when you get a real revelation of what truth is and why your life matters so much, that begins what I call the journey of a lifetime.
Yes, such a needed message. And one of the things in your book that I thought was so powerful too is that we have to, in order to eradicate something unhealthy, you have to identify it and acknowledge it. And so when it comes to hopelessness, which is something you've just mentioned, help us really understand what that actually might mean for somebody in their lives.
Well, when a person is hopeless, they're void of hope. And hope gives faith something to hang on to. And without faith, you're not going to please God. But with it, you could literally transform society as we know it. So, teenagers begin to talk about, we're just teens. We're not that old. I can show you the best-selling book of all times where a 7-year-old and an 8-year-old were kings of a nation. There's no magic age where I think people can really take seriously their life. And when I see people, young people specifically in high schools or conventions, and they begin to catch what I call the intangible asset of hope, they begin to actually see it, and it begins to take root in their life, and it starts in their heart. Then it becomes something that they can really grab hold of and begin to plow, if you will, the purpose of their life and discover, hey, you know what, I do matter. Because if a teenager is broken today and they don't get healed, by default they become broken adults. And brokenness attracts brokenness, like health attracts health. And so when two become one flesh and they're broken, what do they do but recreate generational brokenness?
Right.
And so one of the things that we really strive to do is get people to understand the value of being seen and heard. Because if a teenager today does not feel seen or they don't feel heard, then by default, they buy the lie that their life really doesn't matter. That if they weren't here, someone very special would not be missing. Today in America, according to the CDC, every day in America, 5,600 teenagers attempt suicide. So let me put an arena that seats 12,000 people would fill up every 2.5 days for teenagers who in the previous 60 hours bought the lie.
Wow, amazing. I'm so incredibly thankful that you are preaching this message to teenagers. And this is something that really comes from a personal place. When you are speaking of pain and trauma, you know what that's like because you felt like that as a teenager. So we've got a couple of minutes before the break, and then we'll jump back in. But give us just an overview of your story and where you're coming from with this.
Sure. I grew up in a Christian home in the southeastern region of the United States. Went to church every time the doors were open. Became a Christian at 7. At 15 years old, I was sexually abused. 60 seconds changed the trajectory of my life. At 17, I failed PE. At 21, I said to God, if you're real, prove it. I don't think you are. 2 weeks later, I heard his audible voice. He said, call Mom. I did. My mother was attempting suicide. I got her to a hospital. God saved her life. And the doctor said, I didn't save your mom, your wife, to my dad. It's a miracle of God. I heard miracle of God, and I froze. And so trauma, Liberty, is what happened to us that should never have happened, but trauma is also what did not happen that should have happened. I was emotionally abandoned at 4.5 years old. The second greatest commandment in the Bible is to love your neighbor as yourself. If I don't love me, I can't love you. I can't give you what I don't have. I can't teach you what I've not been taught. And so our whole message, if you will, the whole You Matter campaign, is understanding that bad things do happen to good people, but there's a good God and there's a bad enemy, and God loves you. And so we can unpack any or all of that as you want to, but that's kind of the quick version of my story.
And this is why the message of Job is woven throughout your message to teenagers as well, because that's something that it probably resonates with a lot of them when they hear it, I would imagine.
Oh, it's the verse, Job 33:4, which we're referring to. Those 16 words in that one scripture changed my life, and that's what gave birth to this You Matter book I just wrote. It says, the Spirit of God made you, and the breath of the Almighty gives you life. God's never made a mistake. He created you on purpose, with purpose, and for purpose. And so because he put his breath into you, he created you, he jump-started your life, then by default, you are here with a divine purpose on your life. And when the enemy comes against you and tries his best to steal, kill, and destroy, the billion-dollar question is, what does that devil know about your future? He's petrified you're going to get there, that he's doing everything within his limited power to stop you. That's when teenagers really start to get excited, when they really catch that.
Yes. So we're speaking with Dean Sikes. He's the author of You Matter, Finding Hope and Meaning in Everyday Life, as well as many other books and resources that are just wonderful tools for teenagers and parents of teens. So go to pointofview.net. You can find a link there to Dean's website and his resources. And this is just such a needed message because we are experiencing a mental health crisis in America right now that is affecting so many young people. And it's different than when we were growing up, anybody listening, because the world is different today. And so there are new challenges, but thankfully there is eternal truth that can still reach today's young people with the message of hope. So when we come back from the break, we'll continue talking about that and Dean's message and what he shares with teens. But you can follow along with all of our topics today at pointofview.net. Don't forget, you can listen to it after the fact. If you're just now jumping in and you want to go back and hear what you missed, find the show anytime at pointofview.net. We'll be right back with more after this short break.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Public libraries are dying, but you probably knew that since it is likely you haven't been to a library recently. When author Zach Bissonette first proposed a story about the death of the public library, his editor was shocked. He said, like most people, my memories of libraries are idyllic. Going to the story time as a child, getting my first library card, and studying the library with my friends after school. However, visits to libraries continue to decline. He blames most of the decline on the rise of homeless people in the library. And while that is true, tomorrow I'll discuss two other reasons for the decline in public libraries. Walk into any public library in a large city and you will see lots of homeless people. He observes rather than resisting their role as first responders to the homeless, librarians have embraced it, and to the detriment of everyone else who wants to use the library. One librarian interviewed explained that's why they hired a social worker. He also mentions that most librarians he talked to were nervous about discussing the homeless problem. They're aware of the visible number of progressive librarians and activists who believe public libraries have an obligation to the homeless. When some libraries have implemented limits on bag sizes in response to concerns about bed bugs and bad smells, they have been attacked by homeless advocates. He also counters the argument that libraries are declining because people are reading less. Print sales are up and bookstores are making a comeback. At the same time, when the print book collections in America's public libraries are declining, retail sales of print books rose. The homeless problem in libraries is just one reason for the decline in public libraries. Tomorrow, I'll discuss some other reasons. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view of Israel, go to viewpoints.info/Israel. Viewpoints.info/Israel. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back with Dean Sikes, who has a powerful message of hope for today's teenagers. Dean, I know you mentioned this briefly just a few moments ago, but I'd like to go back and focus on it for a minute. There was a time in your life when you prayed and you reached out to the Lord, and you hadn't been doing that, and you weren't even sure if God was real. And you mentioned that God, He showed up shortly after that in just a miraculous way. So tell us a little bit more about what that experience was like and how that set you on the trajectory that you're on today.
I was on a search at a very young age. I had grown up, like I said, in a Christian home, and all my friends were Christians. And when I had been sexually abused, I just shut down. And, one of the things I share with teenagers is if you do not deal with your emotions will deal with you. And I didn't understand that when I was 17, 18 years old. And so I just kept living life, but I stopped developing emotionally. And so when I hit 21 years old, I was working. I had a little bit of what society says makes you successful, but I was miserable. And so I went to this, all I knew to do. I went back to God, and I didn't believe He was real, even though I knew a lot about Him, but I didn't know Him. And so I said this very almost arrogant prayer, and it was, hey, it's me. I feel stupid here, but if you're real and if you've got something for me to do, prove it. And there was zero faith attached to my prayer, but that's just the goodness of God. And 2 weeks later, as I'm sitting in my office dialing a phone, I literally, behind me to my left, I heard someone say, "Call Mom." And I swung around in my office chair, and I saw no one, but the hair on the back of my neck knew to call my mom. Mm-hmm. And I did. And when she answered, I knew instantly something was terribly wrong. Her voice was slurred. She was disoriented. She didn't sound like herself. And in that moment, when God, who is so very real, and has a voice that is unmistakable, said, "Call Mom," and I did so. My mother was attempting suicide. Wow. And I drove up Interstate 75, and I talked with God for the first time in a really long time. Because honestly, I was angry. I'd been sexually abused. Why do bad things happen to good people? I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't invite that. And so I let all of those emotions just take up residence in my heart. And there was no real room for Jesus because I made a choice. And so, and this is something I share this every day with teenagers, and the relatability factor is off the charts. And so when I got her to that hospital that day, as I'm driving her, She says, Dean, I can't be dying. I said, Mom, you're not going to die, but you're going to have to choose to live.
Wow.
And I believe the most important word in that sentence is not live, but choose.
Mm-hmm.
Because the word teaches us choose you this day. This is a day-by-day thing, who you're going to serve. And so when we get her to the hospital and I get into that emergency room, my dad's there, family and friends are there. They take her back. And 45 minutes later, this doctor walks over to my dad, and this doc has the most bewildered look on his face. He's like, I didn't save your wife. It's a, quote, miracle of God. And I heard him say miracle of God, and I literally froze. And in that moment, I knew in a very personal way that God is real. And then shortly thereafter, he began to just open up doors for me to begin this journey that now, all these decades later, over 4,300 events, 2.5 million students, 300,000 salvations, 126,000 suicides stopped that we know about. And we never charge anyone anything. So I never let money dictate where we go. We go where we're led to go. And we have a lot of opportunities, and we're just so very grateful for the opportunity to focus on reaching teenagers. That's why we exist as a ministry.
Yes, that is so amazing. What an amazing story to share, and something that was in your book that I think is so important to emphasize is that the thing we overcome often becomes our platform.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there are so many people who feel disqualified because of things that have happened to them or things that even they've done. But God is such a redeemer. And what is the reception like when you share that message with teenagers?
Oh, they will stand in line for 30, 45 minutes. Just because what I do is I invite them, and by simply saying this, you were gracious enough to give me 30 minutes of your life, and you listen to me. I want you to feel seen and heard. And if you want to talk, come on down, and I'll stay as long as I can before I have to go to the next event. The students stand in line to share their stories. Why? Again, they want to be heard, and they want to be seen. And if we had time today, I could tell you story after story of testimonies from teenagers who've come up to us afterwards and have just boldly and courageously shared what's happened in their lives. And it's a different world today than it was when I started this, 3.5 decades ago. The challenges teenagers deal with today, they were not dealing with back in the early 90s. Mm-hmm. It's a different society, and social media drives it. And I tell parents, we count our views. In the last 24 months, we've got 148 million views of our videos on social. I don't count our likes. Why? If teenagers today are always counting their likes, they have no idea how much they're loved. Wow. And they look through the lens of social media trying to get validation, and that will never happen. Never.
Right. And this was something that I love too. This question of, do we see ourselves how God sees us? Mm-hmm. And I know another big question for a lot of young people today is, am I worthy of God's love? And you're giving them the message that they don't have to do anything to be worthy of God's love. They already are. But I'm sure that that's even more of a problem today because of social media and the image that so many young people feel pressured to create.
Absolutely. And, it's the number one takeaway I hope teenagers get from our time together is that God is still alive and that God does love you. And second to that, you have nothing to prove. You're breathing. You had nothing to do with breath entering your body. You're breathing. God did not need your help getting into this thing called life. And conversely, he does not need your help getting out of it. When it's your time to go, you'll go. John 17:4, Jesus says this, I have glorified you on the earth. I have finished the work you gave me to do. When Jesus finished, he went to heaven.
Yeah. Now, just because there is so much more awareness of mental health, counseling, resources like that, do you ever get pushback on, the issues are more complex than this, than just preaching the gospel or sharing this hope with teenagers? What's your response?
We have follow-up and we have discipleship. The follow-up our ministry has is my You Matter book, and our discipleship is a book I wrote called Hope 365. It's a daily devotional for teenagers, and it's a free download on our website. Any kid anywhere on the planet who has Wi-Fi can hit that button, and it'll be dropped into their tablets. That said, I'm also a massive supporter of Christian-based counseling. I'm a product of it. I went through counseling. I had a counselor look at me one day and he says, I can help you. I don't care about your ministry. I don't care about what you do. I care about you. And I want to help you get through sexual abuse. And that conversation lasted 11 years. And somewhere along the way, I was asked this question: will you forgive the person who abused you? And my response as a good Christian was absolutely, positively, no. And they said, why? I said, it's not fair. I didn't do anything wrong. And they said, was the cross fair? I went, well, why did you have to go there? And long story short, it took me about 3 or 4 days, but I ended up just going to the Lord, and I did forgive. And after about 3 months, I woke up one morning, and I was free from all the pain that had come from the abuse. What's the point? This is what I shared today with teenagers. When you forgive, and you really do it from a place of true forgiveness, you will get free. And in that freedom, you'll find more of your purpose.
Wow. Amazing message. Dean, it's been so wonderful having you on Point of View with us today. Now, tell listeners where they can go to find resources, maybe book you as a speaker or download some of these things that you have available.
Sure. I'll give you 2 websites, You Matter Book, YOUMATTER book.us. You can get the You Matter book right there. And youmatter.us is all things our ministry, scheduling, resources. Either of those websites will take you on a journey where you can learn more if you're interested in what our ministry does and why we do it.
Wonderful. Well, again, Dean, thank you so much for the work that you're doing and for sharing your testimony and being with us on Point of View today.
Well, thank you so much. I enjoyed it. Have a great afternoon.
You certainly will. Now, again, that was Dean Sikes. And if you just hopped in and heard a little bit of his interview, you can find more information at pointofview.net. And I certainly encourage you to check that out. We have all of the links that he just mentioned available on our website as well. There are so many issues that today's young people are facing that are foreign to those of us who didn't grow up in this environment, that didn't grow up in the digital landscape and the struggles that come with social media and just everything going on in the world. I was a teacher for a time and definitely felt overwhelmed sometimes with just the vast difference there was between today's childhood and the childhood that I experienced. And that's why I'm passionate about helping share resources like Dean's ministry and the things that he's offering to parents and teenagers. So again, go to pointofview.net. Click on those links, share it with anybody that you know that has teenagers or is working with youth. Also, another resource I want to encourage you to take advantage of is our Pray for America emails. We pray for issues, domestic, foreign, anything that's happening in our nation every week, and you can get those prayers and we can join in prayer together. So go to pointofview.net and click on the Pray for America banner. You'll get an email every week with a specific prayer and an additional resource, because prayer is the first thing we should do to address the problems in our nation. We have another great interview coming up with Dustin Garrett. Really excited to talk to him about some of the issues facing young men in our nation. So we'll be right back.
At Point of View, we believe there is power in prayer. And that is why we have relaunched our Pray for America campaign, a series of weekly emails to unite Americans in prayer for our nation. Imagine if hundreds of thousands of Americans started praying intentionally together on a weekly basis. You can help make that a reality by subscribing to our Pray for America emails. Just go to pointofview.net and click on the Pray for America banner that's right there on the homepage. Each week you'll receive a brief news update, a specific prayer guide, and a free resource to equip you in further action. We encourage you to not only pray with us each week, but to share these prayers and the resources with others in your life. Join the movement today. Visit pointofview.net and click on the banner Pray for America right there at the top. That's pointofview.net. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in our land. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Liberty McArtor.
Thanks for being with me today on Point of View. I'm sitting in for Kirby Anderson and just had a wonderful interview with Dean Sikes. You can check that out and those resources for teenagers at pointofview.net. But right now, we're going to speak with Dustin Garrett. Dustin Garrett is a marketing specialist for Samaritan Ministries International, and he's got quite a testimony to share. Dustin, thanks so much for being with us today. Dustin. Well, let me just tell you a little bit about Dustin, and hopefully we'll get him on the line in just a moment. But unfortunately...
Yeah, I'm right here.
Hey, great. There you are. Yes.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it.
All right. Awesome. So, Dustin, there are so many cultural forces, unfortunately, today that are giving men lies about their role in this world, their responsibility to women. You have, unfortunately, some misogynistic influencers that are becoming popular who say men shouldn't get married. There's no benefit. You have the pro-choice movement who says men don't get an opinion on abortion. I want to talk a little bit about your story because these are lies that you're intimately acquainted with, but then you came out of that and you discovered the truth. So can you share your background with us a bit?
Yeah, I'm glad to. Yeah, I'll kind of just make a long story short, but when I was a young man growing up in the Chicagoland area, it wasn't long before I got into drugs and a lifestyle that was really destructive. And when I was 15, my girlfriend had gotten pregnant. And at that time, I didn't know anything about being a father or anything like that. And at that time, I was definitely not, I was on completely far away from the Lord. And I remember, though, me and her finding that out, and the next thing we knew that her parents were, making the decision on what would happen, and the decision was made that she would have an abortion and that I would pay for it. And I remember initially, being relieved at that thought because the idea of having a child was terrifying, and pretty much what everyone was telling us was that if you had a child, it would ruin your life. And I think that's still the lie to this day, is that if you bring a child into this world, now your life is ruined. Children are just overall a burden and not a blessing. And what I thought would be a relief actually ended up, I remember getting a call from her after the abortion happened, and she was just sobbing and crying and describing the experience and the cold instruments that were used. And instead of it being a relief, it ended up just haunting me and bringing so much guilt and shame that I had just, paid for the murder of our child. And I began thinking, was it a boy or a girl? And all these thoughts were swirling around. And I remember at that time I was talking to my dad about it, and in an attempt to kind of console me, my dad then disclosed to me that before I was born and after I was born, my mom had abortions. Oh. And so that just ended up bringing more questions and thinking about would I still be here? Would I have, brothers and sisters? And so it just kind of plunged me and then my girlfriend at the time further into drug addiction. And, we didn't really talk about it after that. And, but what's interesting is that, the lie that it would ruin our life, actually what happened was after that is that obviously, by us plunging into drug addiction, we then started getting into heroin, and I ended up then at a homeless shelter. And, unfortunately my girlfriend, ended up losing her life to a drug overdose. And so, obviously I'm here today talking to you by God's grace. And he's done amazing work in my life, since that time. But it was probably, so that was, when I was around, 23. I spent a good decade after the abortion, shooting heroin. And when I was 23, I ended up at the homeless shelter. And for the first time in my life, some men opened up the Bible and started, showing me what's true. And like the scriptures say, the truth and set me free. And I ended up going to Bible college, and I spent about 7 years at Bible college. And that's where I met my lovely wife. And that's where I think I really started wrestling with this idea of abortion. And it kind of came back up as something that I was trying to think about theologically, and that's where I think I really experienced the grace and mercy of God for that situation, and that I started to lean into the sovereignty of God, and even though all the questions that I had aren't going to be answered this side of eternity, I was able to find forgiveness and able to then talk about it openly. And it was something that I realized for a long time I had been believing a lot of lies about it. And I also realized that I didn't hear a lot of men talking about this topic.
Right.
The men that I did hear about talking about the abortion topic were typically the ones who were, the ones with the signs, in front of the, in front of the abortion clinics. But I didn't hear a lot of men who had been complicit in abortion talk about it, because the truth is that for every abortion that happens, there's a man there somewhere.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And it had affected me deeply, like on a deep level. And I began to think, like, surely I'm not the only one who's been completely just tormented by this. And so I've been able to talk about it, and as I've been able to talk about it, I realized a lot of the conversation is that men need to just shut up about this, and they have no room to speak about this topic. And what's interesting about that line of thinking and that defense is that it just perpetuates the problem. Because the more you tell men that, hey, you don't have to talk about this, you shouldn't talk about this, it just completely removes the responsibility that men should have to pursue women in a way that is loving and not put them in situations like this. And then they don't even have to face it. So to tell men that they shouldn't be in the conversation, again, is the worst thing in regards to it's just letting the men off the hook and continuing this problem, and where the men are really the ones that should be responsible for caring for and loving and cherishing our women. And so I want to be a voice in that says, yes, it does affect men deeply. And there's a lot of things to talk about in this. And so all that to say is that I've been married for 15 years to my lovely wife. And for many of those years, I was believing a lie that we would never have children because of what I did when I was a teenager. I thought for some reason that, what part of my punishment for what I did was never going to be able to have children. But I'm happy to report to you today that God is gracious, and that my wife and I have just a beautiful 4-year-old son and a absolutely precious 6-month-old daughter.
Wow.
And so here I am today, getting to just enjoy them to the fullest.
That's amazing, and praise the Lord. And Dustin, thank you so much for sharing your story with such transparency. And this is a theme that's carrying over from some interviews we had yesterday, too. There are so many lies because the enemy wants to keep us apart. God created men and women for relationship with each other, to work together. And men and women are being isolated from each other. Men told they don't have a voice, and they can't speak up. And then so often that leaves women then feeling isolated and a feeling that the burden is all on them and they don't feel supported in their time of need. But I want to keep talking about your story. We're about to go to a break in a couple of seconds, but it is just amazing to me and such a testimony that God's redemptive work in your life. And a reminder for anybody listening, it doesn't matter what you've gone through or the lows that you've experienced. God can transform your life and redeem it and bring you full circle to where you can be speaking life into other people who need to hear that message. And that's what Dustin's doing today. So when we come back from this short break, we'll talk a little bit more about the great ministry work that Dustin gets to participate in now and how he is reaching young men with this message of truth and how we can do that as well. Right back after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few moments with Dustin Garrett. Dustin, you shared your testimony, and did you think in those low moments of your life that you would years later be working for a Christian ministry that helps to provide health care to people and to do so in a way that people are supported and sharing with each other? Did you think that this is where you would be?
There's not a chance. There's no chance in the world. When I was, at the rescue mission there, I remember when they told me, hey, you should think about going to Bible college and maybe ministering to people. And I remember laughing at them because I had never graduated high school. I got kicked out of high school before I made it to high school. I was homeless, didn't have any money, and was, a decade-long, drug addict. But they were very encouraging to me because I was at that point in time now helping out some of the young men who were coming into the mission and things like that. And so I went off to Bible college, and then when I graduating, I thought I was going to go back and work for the rescue mission, but those doors just were kind of closed. And what was interesting is that the same place the rescue mission was in Peoria, Illinois, there was also a ministry called Samaritan Ministries. And somebody had mentioned it to me, and I looked into it. I'm like, oh, healthcare. Who wants to be working in that field? No, nobody grows up to do that. But then I realized that, okay, this was a ministry that was providing healthcare to Christians and an opportunity for people to have their healthcare needs met without paying for unbiblical things like abortion. So this was a redemptive thing, and that was something I didn't really kind of see coming. I didn't really see the connection there. And I'm so grateful now to get to do the work that I do, and even to they allow me to talk about it like this. And one of the things that's recently happened that's been super redemptive is that I mentioned in the story before the break about how my mom had had an abortion before and after I was born. And for years, she was never able to even talk about it. And then recently, after listening to a podcast that I did, she had come over to our house, and my mom and I got to talk about it for hours. And at the end, was able to communicate to her the forgiveness that's in Jesus. And it was the first time that we had talked about it in our life. And I saw, her receive that. And I saw it turned a whole different leaf in our relationship. And it's just a beautiful thing. So how God has woven all this together, and get to work for Samaritan now and get to tell people about this option for Christians that can meet their medical needs, and then just what God has done with that, even on a personal level in my family, has been beyond my wildest dreams.
Yeah, so beautiful how God weaves our stories. And shout out to our listeners in Peoria. We have a station there. So for people who aren't familiar, and just tell us quickly how Samaritan Ministries works. And this is a life-affirming option, which unfortunately isn't always the case when we're looking at healthcare.
Yeah, so Samaritan's been around for over 30 years, and really it's tapping into the biblical model of Acts chapter 2. So people bearing one another's burdens, Christians taking care of one another. And so really what we're doing here at Samaritan is not anything new. It's actually the model that's been around for thousands of years. The church has been doing this for thousands of years. Samaritan's just tapping into connecting Christians to help each other with each other's medical needs. And how that looks is that each month you get a name of somebody, and you don't send your monthly amount to Samaritan Ministries. Each month you get a name of a real Christian who's had a medical need, and you send a monthly amount straight to somebody who's had a medical need. You pray for them, send them a note or a card of encouragement. And then, God forbid, if you have a medical need, then you would let Samaritan know what that need is, and they'll assign people to send you the funds that you need and send you notes and cards, encouragement. So like just recently, my wife and I had our baby here at home, and that whole thing, through that whole process, people were sending us the funds we needed for that, and also sending us notes and cards of encouragement. So Samaritan's just coordinating and facilitating this massive sharing effort amongst the body of Christ. Right now, it's hundreds of thousands of Christians sharing tens of millions of dollars every month. And again, it's all going to things that would not violate your conscience or be unbiblical. And it's just a beautiful thing. It's not only meeting the financial part of the medical need, but also we're tapping into the spiritual side of medical needs, where people could really use prayer and encouragement, and God is making people more like Christ as a result of that connection.
Yeah. I used it for a time in my life, and I remember writing those cards and pausing for a moment in my busy day to pray for somebody, and that's just something that's really special. We're almost out of... Oh, go ahead. Yeah, jump in.
Well, yeah, I was just going to say, in the midst of medical need, we often think of just the monetary outside. But if you look at your church's prayer list, I'd almost guarantee that the majority of the prayers are physiological medical needs, people that are getting surgeries or cancer or babies. And so when we're in the middle of a medical need, God often uses that time and uses his people to come alongside us and really minister to us in our time of need. So we don't want to miss that at Samaritan.
Absolutely. We have just a couple minutes left, Dustin. And again, you have such a great testimony of how you've given your life to the Lord, and he's worked amazing things in your story. And it's a message that today's young men need, because there's just a lack of purposelessness, or a sense of purposelessness for so many young men. So what's your message today to any young man who may be listening and is wondering what's their place in this world?
Yeah, I mean, people always asking me questions, things about, situations like this, whether it's drugs or abortion and things like that. And I usually always say, hey, if you are not a part of and under the leadership of a local church, having good shepherds who are, that you are committed and underneath their care, then you need to run to that. Because I think that a lot of times we find ourselves in these situations, and almost everybody that I talk to that is in this situation, and if I ask the question, hey, do you have like a good, group of shepherds that are caring for you? And it's almost always no. And so if you're a young man or a family or somebody who's listening, and I know that's hard sometimes, you're trying to find a good church or maybe where you live or something like that, but we know that's God's design and that you really should pursue that. And that's a very important thing for your family. And even if you're a young man before you get married, it would be completely crucial for you to place yourself under the authority of a good local church, a biblical local church, and that brings so much security. It brings so much provision. It's such that when you're in these situations, they're really going to be able to help guide you and help navigate your specific situation, because unfortunately there's no blanket answer for that I can just speak into that will be appropriate for everybody's situation. But that's why it's just very important for that to be the case. So if you're listening to this and you don't have, and you're not a part of a church, run to that. God's goodness is there.
Absolutely.
And that would be my encouragement.
Yes, such good advice. Dustin, thank you so much for being with us on Point of View today. It's been wonderful hearing your testimony and the work that you do for Samaritan Ministries. So we're about to go to another break, and it has just been such a great show already, but we have another hour of wonderful biblical perspective for you on relevant issues that you're facing today. But don't forget to go to pointofview.net if you want to read more about Dustin's story or check out Samaritan Ministries website. You can do that there. And we'll be right back with more after this short break.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places. And some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you, now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give to Point of View today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please, take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
Thank you, Kirby. I really appreciate your program. You cover a lot of issues that a lot of us think about, I'm sure. And this is the first time I've ever called in, so I appreciate your input, too.
Oh, I thank God for what you're doing on Point of View. You guys have more influence across this country than I believe any of them in terms of tackling the issues and getting the truth out to Americans. It's getting to the point where truth just is bottled up on every hand. Every time you turn around, there's another big bottleneck against truth. I hope your listeners realize what Point of View is doing and supports Point of View in every possible way you can.
You know, I can't go to Washington. I can't do those things, so the only way that I can help is the way that God has provided for me, and to give some of that back to you guys. So, like you said, partnering with Point of View, because, you know, you can't do it alone. Thank you very much for what you guys do. Believe me, it's a needed thing, and I just hope everybody certainly would get on the bandwagon with you.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Liberty McArtor.
Thanks for being with me on Point of View. We're going into our second hour of the show. I'm Liberty McArtor, sitting in for Kirby Anderson today. I will just mention that in the second half of this hour, so in just about half an hour, we'll be interviewing Christopher Reese, who is the editor at Worldview Bulletin, and he's going to talk to us about an overlooked argument for God against naturalism. So that'll be a really good apologetics-focused topic there on whether or not it's actually irrational to not believe in God. So not typically what you hear in terms of that argument. So that's going to be a really good conversation. But first, let's talk about marriage. So we've, in the last hour, talked with Dean Sikes about how he ministers to teenagers and gives them hope. We just finished talking with Dustin Garrett, who had a great, just amazing testimony of God's goodness in his life and the truths that young men need to hear. And so let's continue that conversation a little bit, but let's look at it in terms of some data. And there is a report out that is encouraging. You can find the link at pointofview.net. This comes from the Institute for Family Studies, and they are always doing really great research pertaining to family and the issues that are affecting families. So here's some good news. Divorce is in decline. About 40% of today's marriages will end in divorce, and that's down from what we've heard for decades at this point, which is that marriages only have a 50-50, odds of making it. And so they look at the data, they look at what's changed in America, they look at who's getting married, who's not getting married, and they have come to the conclusion, and again, it's always hard. You can't really predict the future or know exactly what's going to happen, but judging with the information that they have, people who get married today are likely to stay together. So this is an encouragement, but let's go through the report just a little bit so that we can understand. Of course, we've all heard the mantra that half of marriages end in divorce. And really that came from, according to the authors of this report, the 1960s, the 1970s, what they call kind of the heyday of hippies through MTV era, where we get the idea that it's 50% of marriages that end in divorce. And the truth is, marital stability today is a lot different than it was 30 years ago. So since the 1970s, kind of the end of that era that they mention, marriages have been gradually getting more and more stable. So there are a couple of different metrics that they use that give you very similar numbers here. So according to the research methods that they're using, marriages formed in the 2010s have about an 18 or 19% likelihood of divorcing, which is low, and that's after 10 years, compared to 30% of marriages ending after 10 years from the 1970s. So you've got a good 10 plus percentage drop there. So we're not quite at the 1950s level in terms of marital stability. At that time, it was only 14% of marriages ending after 10 years. It is a trend in the right direction. So some people are going to ask, okay, what about gray divorce? That's when couples divorce at 50 or older. And so again, if you look at that today, those are still largely marriages that were formed in that era, the 60s to the 70s, kind of into the 80s, where a lot of marriages formed during that time, unfortunately, did end in divorce. And that's just not quite the same today. So In other words, we have more marriages that are likely to make it. And this is also a great news for families, great news for kids, because it means more kids are being born in stable homes with married mothers and fathers. You're at the same time that you see divorce rates going down, you are seeing fewer and fewer unmarried births. What this doesn't mean, however, is that more marriages are happening. People are being more selective about who they marry and when they marry. And that also means that while, that has some good things, obviously, because people are taking marriage a lot more seriously, it also means that there are a lot of young adults who, statistically speaking, will never get married or have kids. So they're saying 1 in 3 to 1 in 4 young adults. So this is why I wanted to bring this up. It's so important, I think, to talk about the truth about marriage, because I just heard it the other day from a young person saying, 50% of marriages end in divorce. And not only is that not necessarily true anymore, it doesn't actually give an accurate picture of the benefits of marriage. And so if we want to encourage this positive trend of fewer divorces, which we all do want to do that, and we want to encourage more young adults who may be hesitant because they saw their parents get divorced, and so they're a lot more careful, but maybe sometimes a little too careful about entering into marriages. If we want to encourage them, we need to give them the truth about marriage. And so this is why I'm going to recommend a resource. We've talked about it on Point of View before. I interviewed Dr. Brad Wilcox last year on his book, Get Married. If you're watching while holding it up, it's blue. It's called Get Married, Why Americans Must Defy the Elites, Forge Strong Families, and Save Civilization. I think this should be required reading for all high schoolers, honestly. Junior, senior in high school, just because it doesn't mean everybody's got to get married, but it has so much data that you just don't hear. In pop culture and mainstream media, you are more likely to hear negative viewpoints that are talking down on marriage, or you're hearing the 50-50 number, even though it's not accurate. And so this is just full of research and, again, data showing the benefits to men and women in marriage. This is just from the inside flap. Both men and women who get and stay married accumulate much greater wealth than people who don't marry. That's something a lot of young people probably haven't heard. It's certainly not what they're hearing from the secular media or the misogynistic influencers who are telling men that they will not benefit from marriage. The opposite is true. Men benefit greatly from marriage. Men and women with families report more meaningful lives. This is another research point that you probably haven't heard. The happiest men and women in America are married moms and dads. Another thing, couples who forge family-first marriages and have a we before me mentality. So again, that bearing one another's burdens, so much of the themes that we've talked about in this show so far today, those are the most successful, most lasting, happiest marriages. So again, if you've got a young person and they don't know what to think, or you want to add it into your at-home school curriculum, I think that teenagers should read this. This is something we need to talk about. That marriages, it's not a coin flip. It's not maybe you'll make it, maybe you won't. Another thing that I think should be taught in every high school is the success sequence. And I'll just give it to you really quickly. Young people who complete high school, work full time, and get married before having kids have a 97% chance of avoiding poverty in adulthood. They're less likely to experience family breakdown down the road, and they're less likely to experience emotional distress. This is relevant information that we need to be telling our young kids so that they know the truth about marriage and family formation, because it's something that our nation is facing. And when you talk about marriage, of course, the next thing that comes up is kids. And so as we see in the news a lot, there's a fertility crisis. People are throwing around different, government solutions to try to encourage more people to have more children. Are those solutions really what it's going to take to build stronger families? I think that it goes a little bit deeper than that, and that's what I want to talk about when we come back from this break. So, see you in just a few minutes.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Yesterday, I talked about one reason why public libraries are dying. I quoted from an author who documented the decline in library attendance due to the rise in homelessness. He isn't the only person to discover this. An article in the Los Angeles Times years ago lamented that libraries had become a de facto shelter for the city's homeless. Another reason for declining library attendance is the internet. A few decades ago, when I was writing articles, columns, or books, I would often have to head off to a library to check a reference found in a magazine, journal, or book. That was usually a weekly phenomenon of checking the stacks and pulling out material for whatever I was writing. Today, an online search usually provides everything I need. Progressive attitudes from the library associations are yet another reason for the decline in library attendance. At first, we were confronted each year by Ban Book Week. Are there some people who are book banners? Probably, but most of the outrage usually centered on parents who were merely asking that some books be moved to a different section that was age appropriate. Now parents are rightly expressing concerns over the promotion of Drag Queen Story Hour. This year, Barnes & Noble announced plans to open 60 new locations, and that is in addition to the 57 new stores it opened last year. One of the bookstore representatives explained, many readers are looking for a place to spend time and connect with other people in their community. Our bookstores offer a safe and welcoming space to meet up with friends and explore the stacks. Of course, that is what the public libraries used to be. Parents and kids feel safer and less assaulted in a bookstore than they feel in a public library. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view of Israel, go to viewpoints.info/Israel. Viewpoints.info/Israel. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
I want to talk about an article that I found at World Magazine by Nathaniel Blake. You can find it at pointofview.net. How to Live Under a Curse. Americans will not have more babies until they see the beauty in bearing another's burdens. I wanted to talk about this because I think it gets to a core issue that is affecting so many problems in our culture, including things we've talked about, this isolation between men and women that we mentioned in our interview with Dustin, this lack of drive and purpose that so many young people are experiencing now. And of course, you've got problems like American birth rate. So as in much of the developed world, birth rates are plummeting. They're below replacement level. So that means people aren't producing enough children to replace them. The population is dying off. So obviously there are implications that come with an aging and declining population. And so this is of importance to people in government because this is going to affect the economy, the GDP. This is going to affect our, structures of our nation and our government in years down the road. But just because people recognize that, okay, numerically, yeah, according to the data and everything, this is a problem, but that doesn't mean they're ready to be part of the solution. As Blake writes, sure, things might be better off in a few decades if more people have babies now, but will my life be better with the baby right now? That's the core question that a lot of people are asking. And that's why government policies alone aren't going to boost the birth rate. But let's keep getting into some of what Blake wrote here. There has been a lot of coverage, obviously, on the declining birth rate, especially because you have people in the current administration, including Vice President J.D. Vance, has been very vocal about pronatalist policies and different different things that we can implement to encourage family formation. But as a lot of women point out in different articles that you can find around the internet, it's still most of the burden of childbearing and child rearing falls on women. Even in our developed, supposedly egalitarian world and system, that's still what happens. And so Blake says what's really at the root of this frustration, even if we don't always realize it, is the curse found in Genesis 3. So what that does is it reveals a brokenness in the family. So the relationship between husband and wife, the relationship between bringing children into the world, the relationship with work, it's all broken. It causes us to be separated from another. Women and children are left vulnerable and dependent, often bearing the burden, the brunt of the burden, or all of the burden in pregnancy, certainly in childbirth, and even raising children. And we've talked about that again throughout this show today, just with the false messages that men are told that they're not needed and they don't have a place and they need to stay out of it. And then you end up with mothers being alone because men are staying out of it. And so women aren't going to have more children just so that the GDP will be higher in 30 years. They will have more children if they believe that the natural family life of marriage and children offers a better and more fulfilling way to live. And so I think that Blake makes some really good points here that even you have some well-meaning people and policies that they are trying to push, but if you've got a primarily male-led or man-centric pronatalist movement that is constantly telling women to, make the domestic sacrifices while they continue to just pursue their careers, you still aren't restoring the balance of the family, of bearing one another's burdens, and that we are supposed to be doing. And the answer to this, of course, is love. It's about learning how to live in a Christ-like manner with your family. So I don't think this means we need to discount certain government policies. For instance, parental leave is a big topic of conversation, child tax credits. Those are things that I think we should consider just because they're maybe the right thing to do, not because they're necessarily going to cause more people to have children. I think as it stands, they are probably they would benefit people who already are having children or already planning to have children. They may not convince more people to have them, but they still are worth doing because they could have a lot of benefits and just the right thing to do for the women who are having children. But you've got to get down to the culture. You've got to address these core questions, again, that Nathaniel Blake articulates so well in that article from World Magazine. And that is what we hear so often in the pro-life movement, too. Women are, as you heard from Human Coalition, Chelsea Yeoman mentions this a lot, Jeff Bradford mentioned it yesterday, 76% of women who are seeking an abortion would rather parent if their circumstances were different. But they're saying, who's going to support me? Who's going to help me bear this burden? Is it even worth it to make the sacrifice? And as Dustin just told us, he was told as a young person who he with his girlfriend experienced an unplanned pregnancy and they were advised or forced to abort. And people said, your lives will be over if you have children. So even when we aren't in those, very dire situations or maybe facing poverty, that's still the message that people receive. And those are so many questions that people ask is, will I be supported? Is it worth bearing this burden at all? And is anybody going to bear it with me? And so a couple weeks ago on the Know Why podcast, I talked about a similar issue where we really need sacrificial relationships in our lives. As we've talked about, there is a crisis of young men, a lot of crises, young adults, a crisis of young men. But one of the common threads that I'm seeing in a lot of these articles, they're interviewing men who aren't working, young men who aren't seeking work. They're not able, they don't really know what to do. They don't know what their purpose is. And so I argued that really what men need is sacrificial relationship. And this is not just me. This is based on data that shows how beneficial it is, again, when men are in marriages and when they are fathers. But it's not just limited to men. This is because we're created in the image of God. I think that this mindset, this need for really meaningful relationships where we are also called to sacrifice and bear one another's burdens, that applies to everybody. We are able to find purpose and meaning in life when we are in those meaningful relationships where we're able to serve one another and where our needs are also met too. We're made in the image of a relational God, and so we're made for relationship, and that's what we need. That is the answer to so many of the questions that I think young people are asking with regard to family and purpose in life. And even if you're not married, again, forming those relationships in your church family, with friends, that you really are bearing one another's burdens. Okay. And this is why I talk about AI a lot. And I know that people may think, oh, you're making too big of a deal of it. It's not necessarily the, administrative functions that AI can perform of making a grocery list for you quickly or something like that. But the fact that more and more people are using it to replace relationships. They're using it as a friend. They're learning to depend on it as they would communicate with a friend. And that's what's concerning, because they think it's fulfilling that desire for a relationship or a friendship. And we're in a loneliness epidemic too, so people are feeling very lonely and isolated. But it's actually not, because it requires nothing. It's not somebody that's going to help you, and an AI chatbot is not somebody that you can help. It is just an illusion, a mirage of relationship that is a counterfeit of what we actually need. So I encourage you, go read that article at World Magazine and think about that issue, because, again, when it comes to family formation, when it comes to marriage, conversations around having children, this is where people are hearing messages that are often negative, that are definitely unbiblical. And this is where Christians can lead the way and we can speak the truth. And there is so much data. Thank God for researchers, because there is so much information out there that backs up what the Bible has already taught us. And of course, that shouldn't surprise us. I'll just mention again before we go to the break that there is another article I recommend you read. I don't have time to get into it right now, but it's called Virtue, Not Virtue Signaling. Again, I always like to mention education, but this is a great article to read, talking about how when we're raising our own kids or when you're talking with your grandchildren, education is not just the transmission of skills, but actually the cultivation of character. And so when we want to talk to children about these issues, when we want to talk to young people about issues of family and sacrifice and what real relationship actually means, we can be doing that in so many different ways as we're bringing them up and as we're having these conversations. It's a real tool that I think you can use. But when we come back, we will be talking with Christopher Reese on an overlooked argument for God and against naturalism. This is going to be really helpful, so we'll be right back after this break.
In 19th century London, two towering historical figures did battle, not with guns and bombs, but words and ideas. London was home to Karl Marx, the father of communism, and legendary Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon. London was in many ways the center of the world, economically, militarily, and intellectually. Marx sought to destroy religion, the family, and everything the Bible supports. Spurgeon stood against him, warning of socialism's dangers. Spurgeon understood Christianity is not just religious truth, it is truth for all of life. Where do you find men with that kind of wisdom to stand against darkness today? Get the light you need on today's most pressing issues delivered to your inbox when you sign up for the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Every weekday, in less than 2 minutes, you'll learn how to be a person of light to stand against darkness in our time. It's free, so visit pointofview.net/signup right now. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Liberty McArtor.
Let's talk about naturalism and let's talk about belief in God. On the phone, I have Christopher Reese, who is the editor-in-chief of Worldview Bulletin, also the author of 100 Old Testament Quotes by Jesus, How Christ Used the Hebrew Scriptures, and always has such great insight in his articles. So, Christopher, thanks so much for joining Point of View again.
Great to be here with you again.
All right, so let's talk about your article, which people can find. It's linked at pointofview.net, an overlooked argument for God and against naturalism. We live in a disenchanted world, and I think people are definitely aware of the fact that in the intellectual circles, there is this perception that belief in God is really childish or embarrassing, that the material world is all we need to pay attention to. But this is actually a fairly new worldview or concept of reality in terms of the whole of human history, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. This has kind of been the predominant viewpoint, starting with the Enlightenment a few centuries ago, and there's been, a gradual shift away from belief in God and toward adopting this naturalistic viewpoint that believes that all that exists is material objects and natural laws, and there's nothing outside of that. No God, no supernatural beings, no miracles, because everything is just contained in this cause and effect universe that we live in.
And when what we would call that is a naturalistic view, but it also leads to a determinist view. So could you explain what that means?
Right. Yes. So as soon as you adopt naturalism as a worldview, it also kind of brings along with it this idea of determinism. And just like it sounds, it just means that basically everything that happens is determined by physical laws and how they affect material objects. So it's sort of like, you can think of it like dominoes. One domino falls and knocks down all the others. And so once domino A falls, domino Z will also eventually fall. And it's all just determined by following these natural laws that govern the universe.
Okay, so that leads to a problem, though. If you are, let's pretend that we adopt that worldview, everything is just determined by material cause and effect. But what does that mean about human thoughts and feelings and behaviors? Are those all things that just are predetermined and we have absolutely no control over? And how do people who adopt this worldview, does that bother them?
Yeah, that's a very problematic aspect about naturalism. A lot of people that adopt naturalism don't really think about that. They'll want to sort of apply it to everything else in the world, but not to human beings. But the same issue comes up with us, as kind of physical objects in the world. And so what that means is that all of our thoughts, our beliefs, our emotions, things that we will, all of that is also determined by these physical laws. And so sort of in a sense, it turns us into sort of puppets or robots, just at the mercy of these physical interactions that are going on around us. Some people who adopt naturalism kind of embrace this and are happy to acknowledge it. Sam Harris is one. He was one of the leading new atheists from a few years back, and wrote a book on free will. And he basically just sort of acknowledges that we don't really have free will. We think we do, but we really don't. And there's a number of other thinkers that kind of follow that same line and will just say, we just have to bite the bullet and admit we don't have free will.
And that seems like such a hopeless worldview if people really believe that, because it seems like it would rob any sense of meaning or purpose in life. And also that we run into another challenge because, if we believe in anything, even if you're an atheist and even if you say, yeah, this is, everything is predetermined, we don't really have free will, that atheist is still likely to have some sort of moral standard that they've adopted. But where did those beliefs come from if everything is just predetermined? That starts to be a pretty big problem, doesn't it?
That's true. This is not really a livable worldview. No one, even people who say, okay, this is what I believe, this is a naturalistic universe, we don't have free will, but no one really lives that way, and you really can't. I think if anyone really did believe that, they would probably go crazy because, you're just understanding that you're just sort of programmed to do certain things, and you have no choice in the matter. And that's true. When it comes to moral issues, we're really just following our programming, and so you can't blame anyone for doing anything wrong. You also can't praise them for doing anything right because we're all just sort of following what the physical laws tell us to do.
And that if you want to really ask somebody whether they buy into that, then that means, okay, the criminal was always predetermined to be a criminal, and there is nothing that anybody could have done to intervene or nothing he can do to turn his life around. And then again, it's just kind of leaves you hopeless. And I think that deep down, most people probably don't actually believe that. They certainly don't want to. So the rest of your article goes through and you summarize an argument from C.S. Lewis called The Argument from Reason. So before the break, let's get into the first one here, that no belief is rationally inferred if fully explained by non-rational causes. So can you break that down in layman's terms for us, what that first step of this argument really means?
Sure. So this is just sort of one more negative outcome of naturalism. You don't have free will, there's no morality. And on top of all of that, we can't even reason because what's happening in our brains is also determined by natural laws and material objects. And those processes are not rational. They're following irrational, purposeless laws. And what that does in effect is it robs us of the ability to reason. Reason involves being able to draw conclusions, examine a situation through the laws of logic, think about how they relate to each other, and then draw a conclusion from all that. But under naturalism, none of that can happen because what's going on in your brain are chemical and physical reactions with no purpose or design behind them. And so we, in effect, lose the ability to reason on that worldview.
And it's ironic that it seems like a lot of the argument for a lot of secularists is that reason is pitted against belief in the supernatural. And if we can use our reason, we can use our mind, but it's actually the opposite, isn't it? This argument shows us that really, if you are able to reason as a human being, if you are able to infer things from evidence, if you are able to recognize and acknowledge any sort of moral system or moral code for things or system of belief, that actually has to come from somewhere else. It can't just be an accident. And if you are really buying into a naturalist worldview, then that's the logical conclusion you have to accept, is that all of these beliefs that we hold, the moral standards that we hold, the very reasoning we think that we're doing is all just an accident of chemicals and physical things. And so this is something that is a good way to really challenge that naturalist or secular worldview. And there's a lot more to get into, and we'll try to cover as much as we can when we get back after this short break.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few minutes with Christopher Reese. We're going through arguments for God and against naturalism. So naturalism is the worldview that says everything can be explained by natural causes, by the material world that we observe. But therefore, everything is determined because everything is simply a reaction to something else. But we run into a problem with that worldview when we start to say, okay, well, what does that mean for us as human beings and the fact that we are thinking about this? Where do our thoughts and our reasoning skills and our beliefs come from? Is it truly all just a reaction in our brain? So one of the points here is that we have to have a good reason to accept naturalism, or we have a good reason to accept naturalism only if it's rationally inferred from evidence. Is this something that we can rationally infer, that there's no deeper meaning to the things in our world?
No, I don't believe so. There really is no positive evidence for naturalism. It's hard to think of what kind of evidence you might come up with that. How can you demonstrate that all that happens in the universe is purely physical interactions, physics and chemistry? There's really no evidence for that. So that worldview is on very shaky ground. Theism, there's lots of strong arguments for belief in God, lots of arguments for the truth of Christianity, but naturalism really has very little going for it in terms of rational evidence.
And I think that maybe, and I don't want to just presume something, but you are seeing a little bit more interest in religion or the supernatural, at least, among young people. And I wonder if it's because people have a deeper sense, even if maybe they haven't gone through, every single step of the argument from reason. Maybe they have an innate sense that it doesn't make sense, that there's not something else out there. I'd love to get your perspective on that, Christopher.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think a lot of people became disillusioned with the new atheism. That movement, I think, was around for about a decade and kind of ran its course. And all those guys were strong naturalists. The main spokesman, Richard Dawkins, and those guys.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I think there's a lot of sort of discontentment with that. When people really start to think about the implications of this for my life, there's no free will, there's no basis for morality. When I die, that's it. I'm gone forever. God made us in His image, and we have this desire for transcendence. Ecclesiastes says that God has put eternity in our hearts. And John Calvin, the theologian, talked about a sense of the divine that every human being has. And so human beings will always seek for something transcendent. And so naturalism is a kind of a very anti-human type of philosophy in that sense.
Yes, and this is important, I think, when we're at that moment, I'll say again, in human history where people are realizing that, okay, the natural world doesn't explain everything, to actually be able to articulate that. So let's jump back into some of these arguments. And again, we've got this article posted at pointofview.net for anybody who wants to read that or maybe print it off, go through it with your kids. That would be a good exercise. But something that C.S. Lewis said is that there really is a problem for naturalists as soon as they attend to the fact that they're thinking. So basically, once somebody becomes conscious of the fact that they are conscious, that they're thinking, that they're having thoughts, then it opens up the question, okay, well, where are those thoughts coming from? And it gets to kind of this debate that we've talked about on Point of View before, where is the mind separate from the brain, right?
Right. Yeah. So this, this naturalism, as Lewis pointed out, and he wrote about this in his book Miracles quite a bit. It's sawing off the branch that you're sitting on. If you accept it, it's going to result in you falling off the tree. It's what's sometimes called a self-refuting position, right? If you accept it, okay, I believe in naturalism, all of a sudden, but now I can't trust my own thinking because, it's just purely, my thoughts are purely determined by purposeless physics and chemistry. And so by adopting that viewpoint, all of a sudden you can't trust the thing that your brain tells you or your mind. And that is an important aspect. Scripture teaches that we are bodies and souls, and the reason that we can reason is that we have souls, and those souls are outside of the effects of physics and chemistry, allowing us to think and be rational and have a relationship with God. All those things that we couldn't do if we were just locked into the physics and chemistry.
Yeah. Such great stuff. So many great resources there. And I wanted to mention this just because I do have an article related to this topic already posted at pointofview.net today. But Christopher, I believe the last time we spoke on Point of View, it was about classical education. And this just reminds me why the topic of logic is so important. Because if we are able to reason as human beings, reason leads us to the Lord, but so many people really aren't taught how to do that and to really look at arguments in this depth, are they?
That's true. And, really, modern science owes its development to the idea that God is a rational God who created a rational universe and created human beings so that we could apprehend and understand God's creation. And that's really one main reason that modern science only arose within Christian Europe, because it had a worldview that could sustain a scientific enterprise like that. And so, yes, our learning and ability to reason really depends strongly on belief in a rational God who made a orderly, organized universe.
Yes, indeed. Well, we're almost out of time today, but thank you so much, Christopher, for being on Point of View Radio today.
Thanks very much for having me.
And thank you for listening today. It's been a great show. Just as a recap, we talked with Dean Sikes. He has an amazing ministry for teens. So if you missed that interview, go to pointofview.net and check out his website. We talked with Dustin Garrett of Samaritan Ministries and his amazing testimony. And this is just such a great resource for you as well. So again, I encourage you to go to pointofview.net, print out that article on the argument for God, and go through it with your family, with your small group, with your friends, because it's just so amazing how God gives us the tools that point us back to Him and back to His truth. And hopefully we can help you a little bit on Point of View to do that as well. It's been great being with you these last 2 days. Tomorrow, it's the weekend edition hosted by Dr. Merrill Matthews. That's going to be a great conversation as always. So we'll see you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
The Bible tells us not to worry, and yet there is a lot of worrying stuff in our world today. Thankfully, the Bible doesn't stop at telling us not to worry. God gives us a next step. He says we need to pray. But sometimes even knowing what to pray can be difficult. And that is why Point of View has relaunched our Pray for America movement, a series of weekly emails to guide you in prayer for our nation. Each week, you'll receive a brief update about a current issue affecting Americans, along with a written prayer that you can easily share with others. We'll also include a short free resource for you in each email so you can learn more about the issue at hand. Will you commit to pray for America? Go to pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner at the top of the page to subscribe. Again, that's pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in America. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.